He risked everything in front of the world, but what he hid behind closed doors is even more shocking. Decades of secrets, untold stunts, and one final plan buried under tarps and silence. This isn't a tribute, it's a revelation. Stay to the end, you need to see this. What Evel Knievel hid from the world. It was legally invisible. Like Evel Knievel wanted it forgotten before it was ever found. When Robert Craig Knievel, known to the world as Evel Knievel, died in 2007, the world mourned the passing of a daredevil icon. His jumps had defined an era. His crashes had defined his legend. But while fans replayed old footage and news outlets ran tributes, one piece of his life remained untouched, physically, legally, and emotionally. Tucked behind an unmarked steel door on the industrial edge of Butte, Montana, stood the garage no one was allowed to enter. It wasn't a secret in the usual sense. People in Butte had seen it. Some remembered trucks hauling covered motorcycles in late at night. Others recalled Evel slipping in and out alone. Yet after his death, it became something else entirely. A vacuum. No memorials, no access. Even his closest associates claimed ignorance. Estate lawyers tried to enter and were turned away. Property records showed conflicting ownership. Alarms were installed. Cameras appeared. Every effort to pierce the garage's secrecy was stalled by red tape, by silence, and by what began to feel like intentional design. Neighbors whispered about prototype bikes and hidden injuries. Fans speculated about hoarded memorabilia or even criminal secrets. But the family stayed quiet. Evel's son Robbie refused all interviews about it. The legal estate excluded it from public inventories, and the longer it remained shut, the more mythical it became. And when the doors finally opened, they didn't just find machines, they found something sacred. If this story already has you seeing Evel Knievel in a new light, hit that like button to help more people uncover this hidden chapter. And drop a comment with your thoughts. Was he a legend, a mystery, or something even more human? Inside the warehouse vault, everything was exactly where he left it. Not curated, not cleaned, not touched, as if he planned to return. The inside of the garage was nothing like what anyone had imagined. There were no museum displays, no spotlighted helmets, no framed accolades. Instead, it was clinical, functional, almost obsessively so. Dozens of motorcycles stood wheel to wheel beneath thick canvas covers. The air smelled of old fuel, aged rubber, and silence. A calendar from 2004 still hung on the wall, its pages curling. A single date circled in red. May 12th. No one knew why. Tools sat arranged on metal benches, spaced with almost mathematical precision. Every wrench had a place. The oil-stained rags looked like they had been folded with intention. Against one wall were shelves of helmets, some pristine, others visibly cracked or scorched. Each bore signs of real use. And behind them, black and white photographs had been tacked to the wall. Images of stunts never published, crashes never discussed, faces long forgotten. There was no signage, no organization, just personal order. It wasn't chaos, it was control. This was no shrine to ego, it was a workshop paused mid-thought. Nothing was polished, nothing was staged, and yet it all felt sacred, like a chapel to a man's inner life. For decades, Evel had portrayed himself as a wild card, a risk-taker, a human explosion. But inside these walls, he had moved with care, measured, quiet, focused. There was no applause here, just intention. But one section held the machines that nearly ended him, and they weren't put there to be forgotten. By the way, every tool and piece of gear we trust is linked below. If you're chasing legacy or just keeping your ride alive, it's all there. The wrecks he rebuilt in secret. These weren't just broken bikes, they were unfinished conversations, with gravity, with trauma, with himself. In the farthest corner of the garage, beneath tarps faded with time, lay the wreckage. The bikes Evel Knievel never let the world see. Unlike the performance models kept pristine in his public collections, these machines told another story. They bore twisted frames, cracked tanks, torn leather, and scorched decals. Some had streaks of dried blood under the clear coat. These were the bikes from the stunts that went wrong. The ones that broke his ribs, shattered his pelvis, collapsed his lungs. But they hadn't been thrown away. They had been brought home. Next to many of them were labeled boxes of parts. Evel had been quietly rebuilding them, not for exhibition, not for resale, but for himself. In some cases, he had fully repainted the frames. Others were mid-repair with sockets still clamped around stripped bolts. A few had notes taped to them. Needs new suspension. Check compression. The work wasn't rushed. It was personal, painstaking, reverent. To the public, Evel had always bragged about bouncing back. He spoke of pain like it was a punchline. But here was the proof that the damage never left him, and that he had never left it either. In rebuilding the bikes, he was not chasing nostalgia. He was confronting failure. These weren't trophies. They were therapy. He didn't want anyone to see this. Not fans, not family, not even his crew. Because this wasn't performance. It was penance. But deeper in the shadows sat something he never attempted to rebuild. Because even Evel had limits. The Rocket Harley he never rode, boxed in by spare parts and rusting cabinets, was the most dangerous machine Evel Knievel ever constructed. At first glance, it looked like a stretched-out Harley-Davidson chopper. But welded to the frame were two side-mounted rocket pods, salvaged from a military aircraft program and crudely modified to attach to the bike's chassis. The tires had been reinforced. The rear struts rebuilt in aerospace-grade alloy. Scrawled in red paint across the front fender were two words: Sky Gunner. Blueprints scattered nearby told the rest of the story. In the mid-1980s, Evel had designed one last stunt, his final act. The goal: to jump the length of a football stadium using rocket-assisted thrust, followed by a parachute braking system. Calculations on the blueprint showed he would have needed to hit speeds exceeding 130 miles per hour before launch. There were notes in his handwriting, trajectory sketches, heat resistance warnings, engine timing estimates. And then there was the most haunting discovery: a scrap of paper taped inside the helmet next to the bike, reading, "If I die, let it be loud." The Sky Gunner had been fully built, tuned, primed, but it had never been tested. Evel Knievel, the man who jumped canyons and crashed into history, had chosen not to ride this one. Whether it was a final act of fear or clarity, no one knows. But perhaps for the first time, Evel recognized a limit that wasn't meant to be crossed. If Evel had doubts, he hid them well. But on one set of film reels, those doubts spoke for themselves. The footage he hid from the world. No audience, no edits. Just Evel, alone, talking to the camera. And sometimes to himself. That was the unfiltered reality discovered in a rust-colored fireproof safe buried deep in the back corner of the garage. Tucked between tax forms, licensing contracts, and racing credentials were several film reels, some dusty, some pristine. They were labeled in his unmistakable scrawl, M12 Backup, KC Cutalt, Night R1. No one had ever seen this material. Not on television, not in documentaries, not even in bootleg fan compilations. It had never left the garage. What these reels captured wasn't more of the daredevil myth. It was everything that unraveled when the audience went home. Failed jumps, some minor, some violent, played out without dramatic music or slow-motion edits. You could hear bones snap. You could hear him groan. There were scenes of Evel limping away from crashes, throwing tools in frustration, or slamming a door in silence. But more powerful than the visuals were the monologues, late-night recordings where Evel sat alone in his workshop, facing a static camera. His voice was low, his tone uneven. "They think I'm fearless," he muttered on one reel. "I just don't show them the parts that scare the hell out of me." Another featured him pacing, mumbling ideas for future stunts, only to stop and whisper, "I don't know if I can do this anymore." This wasn't an act. This was Evel Knievel in the rawest form ever captured, unperforming. His cadence stumbled, his hands trembled, and sometimes he looked straight at the lens like it was a mirror he couldn't escape. There were also reels that defied expectation entirely. One showed him teaching a child to ride a bicycle, steadying the seat with surprising tenderness. Another caught him rehearsing a speech in front of a mirror, stuttering, cursing, restarting. This was not the polished icon in the white leather suit. This was a man reckoning with the weight of his own image, afraid not of dying, but of not living up to the character the world demanded. The public thought Evel Knievel only lived for spectacle, but these reels proved he also lived in fear of being exposed. And yet, for all this vulnerability caught on film, not once did he mention the other secret hidden in that garage, the one built not for himself, but for the children he never met. And he had one last message, and it wasn't on a plaque or a podium. It was a letter, written in ink, never sent, and addressed to the company that helped build his legend. The letter he never sent Harley-Davidson. It wasn't fan mail, it wasn't hate, it was the kind of truth only a dying man writes and never sends. The letter was found folded in quarters, stored inside a brittle manila envelope, buried under Evel's old jumpsuits and press packets. It was handwritten in a neat, deliberate script. At the top, it simply read, "To Harley." What followed was unlike anything Evel had ever said in public. He began with gratitude. He thanked Harley-Davidson for years of partnership, for the machines that launched him across fountains, canyons, and fire pits. He named engineers he respected. He praised the soul of their bikes, the sound, the weight, the resilience. But halfway through, the tone shifted. Evel accused the company of trading soul for stock price. He criticized their pivot to corporate branding, to merchandise and licensing, to making bikes for showroom floors instead of arena floors. "We made each other," he wrote, "but you left the table too early." It was the voice of a man who felt not just left behind, but betrayed. Not for lack of money, but for lack of conviction. Evel believed motorcycles were extensions of identity, not products. He believed they should roar, not purr. The final paragraph had been scratched out so violently that the words were unreadable, only faint scars where a pen had once moved in anger. He never mailed the letter. Maybe he didn't want to start a war. Maybe he knew no one at the top would read it. Or maybe he was afraid of how final it would feel. Either way, it stayed hidden. But it wasn't the only thing Evel turned his back on, because just a few years after writing that letter, he was given a chance to shape the future of motorcycling. And he walked away from it. The one investment that could have changed everything. The company is now worth over $1 billion. Evel called it too risky. The folder was thin, no more than 6 pages, labeled with a sticky note that said simply, "Diagnostics pitch. Pass." Inside were printouts from an early tech startup in the motorcycle world. The offer was simple. Invest 10% in exchange for lifetime use of Evel's name with no public commitment. He would be a silent partner. The technology was revolutionary. Real-time bike diagnostics, wireless telemetry, suspension adjustment via onboard sensors. In short, the brain of tomorrow's motorcycles. The proposal came around 2001. The founder admired Evel deeply and believed he represented not just past glory, but a bridge to the future. Evel declined without hesitation. Scrawled at the bottom of the final page was a note in his handwriting. "Real bikes don't need brains." It was more than a business decision. It was philosophical. Evel didn't believe in technology riding for the rider. He saw it as an erosion of skill, of instinct, of muscle memory. His refusal wasn't financial, it was spiritual. He saw the future and chose to stay in the past. By the time the company went public, its valuation had passed $1 billion. That 10% stake? It would have out-earned every Evel Knievel merchandise line, every endorsement deal, every guest appearance combined. His advisors reportedly begged him to reconsider, but Evel was unmoved. He wasn't trying to evolve. He was trying to preserve something he believed the world was already forgetting: the purity of risk. And yet Evel's greatest gamble wasn't financial. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't even philosophical. It was emotional. Because buried deeper than this deal memo was a will, a handwritten declaration that never made it to court, never made it to the press, and might have changed how the world remembers him. Lawsuits he took to the grave. As soon as the locks came off Evel Knievel's legendary garage, the lawsuits began. It was as if the scent of unopened opportunity and undocumented assets drifted through the air like oil fumes, drawing out everyone who had ever touched his orbit. Former producers, stunt coordinators, engineers, and even family-adjacent advisors emerged from the shadows, each with a claim in hand. Some held typed contracts. Others arrived with blurry faxes, unsigned letters, or emails dated back to the earliest days of dial-up internet. The message was the same. We were promised something. Mechanics said they'd built custom bikes Evel never paid for. A cinematographer argued that outtakes stored in Evel's garage included footage he was legally owed a cut of, footage Evel had allegedly promised to keep private. There was even a former business partner who claimed he'd designed a logo for a failed Knievel-branded energy drink and now demanded royalties for any photos in which the prototype can appear. What made these disputes even more tangled was that many had been whispered about, delayed, or quietly settled in decades past. Now, with Evel gone and his estate in probate, the quiet gloves were off. In a drawer buried under old calendars and expense receipts, attorneys discovered multiple non-disclosure agreements. Some were signed in the 1970s, others in the early 2000s. A few had clearly been drafted under duress. Scribbled edits in the margins, signature lines partially torn. Evel had always been seen as a solo act, a man who needed no team. But these documents painted a different picture. A stunt empire stitched together by handshake deals, patched over conflicts, and legal duct tape. One of the most bitter disputes involved a never-released documentary, partially shot during Knievel's final comeback attempt in the 1990s. The production company argued that the raw footage, some of which was found in the fireproof safe behind his workbench, belonged to them. Evel's estate disagreed. The resulting standoff halted the footage's release, keeping Evel's final jump, one that ended in failure and hospitalization, unseen by the public to this day. But among all the arguments about footage rights, trademarks, and mechanical invoices, one envelope stood apart. It was hand-addressed, sealed, and carried no demand. And what was inside wasn't about money. It was about meaning. The will that was never filed. In the bottom of an old filing cabinet tucked behind a stack of unused autograph photos and brittle fan mail was a manila envelope. It was creased, grease-stained, and sealed with yellowing tape. When opened, it revealed Evel Knievel's unmistakable handwriting. The first words weren't a legal preamble. They were a memory. I met a kid in Kansas City who rebuilt his dirt bike from a dumpster, said he wanted to be like me. This wasn't a will in the traditional sense. There were no percentages, no estate allocations, no legal jargon, just a raw document, dated but unsigned, that outlined what Evel wanted to happen after he was gone. He wrote about garages he'd visited, about teenage mechanics fixing old clunkers behind their parents' homes, about the power of teaching someone how to build instead of just telling them to jump. It was an idea more than a directive. A plan to take his earnings, his royalties, his bikes, and create a mentorship fund for underprivileged young builders. There were no lawyers copied, no notary present, just a closing line. Maybe the world needs more wrenches than ramps. His official estate plan, filed years earlier, made no mention of this fund. It divided his property along more predictable lines. Whether Evel meant to rewrite it or simply hesitated too long, no one could say for sure. Some believe he intended to sign the handwritten version eventually. Others think it was more of a confession than a plan, a final attempt to shift his legacy from spectacle to substance. But what's clear is that Evel was trying to say something with this document. It wasn't about the crowds. It wasn't even about redemption. It was about utility, legacy, and the type of freedom you can hand to someone in the form of a wrench and a wire brush. Still, this quiet pivot was only part of the story, because Evel's deepest apology wasn't in a will. It was in a box, addressed to the son who carried his name and his shadow. Letters to his son. Inside a plain cardboard box marked only with one word, Rob, they found letters, dozens of them. Some folded neatly, others stuffed hastily into envelopes that had never been sealed. They spanned more than 2 decades, beginning in the late 1980s and ending just months before Evel's death. Each one was addressed to Robbie Knievel, Evel's son, and each offered a glimpse into a man who had spent a lifetime being louder than his feelings. The letters weren't polished. They weren't always kind, but they were brutally honest. One began with a single line. "You were supposed to fly farther than me, but I never asked if you wanted to." Others were filled with old racing advice, suspension tweaks, engine comparisons. They'd switch mid-paragraph from metaphors about fatherhood to detailed notes on throttle response. That was Evel's language, emotion hidden in machinery. Over time, the tone shifted. Early letters were instructional. Later ones became reflective, almost pleading. Evel wrote about his failures, not just the crashes or the lawsuits, but the dinners missed, the apologies swallowed. He spoke about the cost of being a brand instead of a parent, about the burden he knew Robbie carried, not just to ride, but to be Evel Knievel's heir, both in leather and in myth. Some letters were never opened. Robbie, overwhelmed by grief and resentment after Evel's funeral, had stored the box away. Only years later did he begin to read them, sometimes one at a time, sometimes all at once. In the bottom of the box, taped to the back of one final letter, was something that caught his breath. A folded blueprint, not for a business deal, not for a retirement plan, for a final stunt. The final stunt plan. It was drawn by hand, blue ink on aging graph paper, annotated in red, titled in block letters, "Freedom Jump." The blueprint included a long elevated runway, a flaming wall, rocket boosters, a parachute escape sequence so complex it would have required split-second timing and engineering precision rarely seen in live stunts. Every angle was measured, every trajectory calculated, wind resistance, ignition lag, emergency abort paths. It wasn't a fantasy sketch, it was a stunt plan. But here's the part that chilled everyone who saw it. Evel had drawn it in the final year of his life. He never built it, never spoke of it, never tested a prototype, no ramp, no rehearsals, nothing but the drawing and a single note clipped to the top. "If this works, tell them I'm free." Some believe it was a last act of theatrical genius, a retirement fantasy he never had the strength to pull off. Others suspect it was something darker, a final jump not meant to be survived, a way to die on his own terms, wrapped in spectacle. Robbie never publicly commented on the drawing, but those close to him said he stared at it for a long time, then folded it quietly and placed it back in the envelope. The blueprint never left the drawer, but its presence haunted every decision that followed. Because once Evel's final plan was uncovered, the question was no longer what to reveal, but what to protect. We went deep for this one, sifting through interviews, estate records, court filings, and eyewitness accounts to bring you the full truth. If you appreciate this kind of research-driven storytelling, consider subscribing. The garage that will never open again. In the weeks that followed, the estate made a quiet decision. The garage, now fully cataloged and documented, would not become a museum or a tourist destination. The family voted to seal it permanently. Some bikes were donated to museums, others were returned to private storage, but many stayed right where they had been found, covered in canvas, untouched by public hands. Robbie Knievel took it upon himself to deliver the miniature bikes. He did it without press releases, without cameras, just him and the names on each bike: Sophie, Marcus, JT, Allie. Some of the children had passed, some families had moved away. But the gesture, even decades delayed, felt right. The footage, Evel's raw, unedited voice, was stored in a temperature-controlled archive in Montana, with viewing rights limited to family. His final blueprint, the Freedom Jump, remains folded in a drawer, sealed in plastic, resting beside the helmet he never wore. The story, now complete, transformed from public myth into family trust. What was once Evel Knievel's secret world became Robert Knievel's legacy, one that required protection, not exploitation. His children understood now that his greatest creation wasn't a stunt or a record. It was a space, a garage where contradictions could live without needing resolution. And yet what he left behind wasn't just metal and mystery. It was something far harder to define and far more important to carry forward: what he left behind. Evel Knievel's final legacy cannot be auctioned. It cannot be rebuilt. It cannot even be fully understood. What he left behind was an invitation to see the man behind the legend and to confront what it means to live boldly, love imperfectly, and die with questions unanswered. He was flawed. He was reckless. He was generous and angry, private and proud, a father who sometimes failed, and a performer who couldn't stop performing. We inherit all of it: the showman and the builder, the ghost and the man who outran him. Evel Knievel wasn't a clean legacy. He was a contradictory one. But that's what makes him real. The garage wasn't just filled with bikes and blueprints. It held grief, regret, hope, wounds that never healed, plans that never launched, bikes that never roared. It held the unspoken, the unheard, the unperformed. And in its silence, it revealed what no jump ever could: that Evel Knievel didn't want to be remembered as invincible. He wanted to be remembered as someone who mattered. If this gave you a new perspective on Evel Knievel, the man behind the myth, hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you never miss the stories others are too afraid to tell. And if you want to see where the motorcycle world is heading next, watch our deep dive on Honda just unveiled 5 new bikes for 2026. The industry is stunned. What they revealed has the entire industry on edge.